Team lead at GIZ Uganda for the Global Carbon Markets Program. And Sven, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Bianca, and good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome to this series of private sector dialogues on carbon markets in East Africa. As Bianca mentioned, my name is Sven Eckbers. I work with GIZ Uganda, where I'm heading the carbon markets promotion project in East Africa. And we are hosting this workshop here with the support of the German Ministry of Environment and in partnership with the East African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance. And you've just heard Bianca, who is the coordinator of that alliance, and of course all the member countries that are behind that initiative. We are also doing this together with my colleagues from the UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Center in Kampala, and the Climate Finance Innovators Project, which is, I think, represented today by colleagues from Perspectives Climate Group and Carbon Africa. Yeah, as you're probably very much aware, signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015 established a new generation of carbon markets through its Article 6. And the key objectives for those market mechanisms are to serve as a tool to mitigate climate change and at the same time to promote sustainable development and raising climate change ambition. This workshop, and as you might have already hinted from the title, focuses on the private sector in East Africa and its very important role in achieving those goals that I just mentioned. And the private sector entities have served already a key part by offering, for example, practical experiences in the implementation and investment in carbon market projects. In East Africa, specifically, the majority of carbon markets projects have been financed by the private sector, and also the private sector was very actively involved in the voluntary market. We believe, and that's why we're doing this workshop, it's very important that the private sector continues to engage in the new market framework, and this requires, of course, reflecting on existing experiences as well as the anticipated future carbon market rules to navigate the transition from the instruments of the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement. And yeah, in a nutshell, this is very much the focus of these dialogues to build readiness for the potential CDM transition and future implementation of Article 6 amongst existing and aspiring carbon asset developers in East Africa. And since we have some time restraints, I was instructed to be very short and brief. So I will leave it here, and yeah, we'll hand it over back to Bianca and wish you all a very fruitful and engaging discussions in the next couple of days. Yeah, back to you, Bianca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven. Welcome, everybody. As he's mentioned already, I'm the coordinator for the Eastern Africa Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance. And just to give a bit of a background, the Alliance was launched last year in June 2019. And basically the main aim is to ensure that its members participate in carbon markets activities long term. And those are the members in the region, which consists of Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia, and most recently Sudan. And of course, we're looking to expand. So the private sector, many of you who've been invited here today, are a key part of ensuring that this is actually successful. The private sector has mobilized quite a bit of investment already through the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, as Sven has mentioned, with the voluntary markets. But we are now moving into the Paris Agreement, and we need to understand where we've come from so as we can know where we're going with the cooperative approaches and the new market mechanism that are going to fall under the Paris Agreement. So basically, as in a nutshell as well, I don't want to go too deeply into it or to repeat. The aim of these series of workshops that we're having is basically to enhance readiness for you, the existing developers and the new developers, to understand what the possible transition of CDM activities entails, and also how to get into the new mechanisms that will be coming in with an agreement in the negotiations on cooperative approaches and the rules on the new mechanism. So in a nutshell, I'll be taking you through the 3 sessions and what we're aiming to achieve. And in today's session, the first one, we'll be looking at carbon market engagement and CDM transition. Here we'll be looking at what the status of carbon markets is right now, and basically from a perspective of how the negotiations are ongoing, and then how it's going to impact the Eastern Africa region. And then of course, as mentioned before, there's been activity in the region, and we're going to have a deep look at what this means for the projects in Eastern Africa and what transition would look like in the event of an outcome in the negotiations. Then on the second day, we're going to look at the key features of what the Paris Agreement has in relation to carbon markets, because one thing that we need to understand or not forget is that Article 6 does not operate on its own. It doesn't operate in isolation. It works as part of the agreement. And now that we have nationally determined contributions, NDCs, we really have to understand how market activities can coincide with the implementation of NDCs or be done in a manner that's quite transparent and ensuring environmental integrity. So we'll have a whole session dedicated to that, and we'll also be looking at how the voluntary markets, what kind of a role they'll be playing under the Paris Agreement now with the implementation of NDCs. And then lastly, we'll be looking at the piloting of Article 6 activities because the negotiations at the moment are not very clear. There hasn't been a clear-cut decision, but that doesn't mean activities in these areas hasn't commenced or hasn't started. And there's a lot of piloting activities that have been ongoing, laying the foundation for what's going to come and contributing to what cooperative approaches and the new mechanism might look like. And the good thing with a lot of these approaches is they're also showing how they can be operated in the most efficient manner. So we'll have a day to look into that with peer-to-peer exchange as well, and breakout sessions where we can talk more and discuss what we've been hearing and building up on over the past 2 sessions. So I'll hand over to Tim Kalman right now, who will be co-moderating this session today with me and to take us through housekeeping.
Thanks, Bianca. Yeah, good afternoon. The task of just reminding everybody very quickly around the new normal of navigating through the online platform. We notice we're using Zoom today, which is usually self-explanatory and user-friendly. But just to remind everyone, your audios will be muted throughout the session or from your side. So just please ensure that they're turned off throughout just to facilitate the webinar moving forwards or the workshop. You can also turn the video feed off yourself as well if that's if you're struggling with bandwidth. And maybe the most important diagram available throughout. So please type any questions at any time through the chat, and I have colleagues monitoring the chat to everybody, make sure it's to everybody. Colleagues monitoring the chat who will then process those later for the Q&A sessions. And then finally, just on the The presentations will be made available at the end, likely via email to all of the people who took part. So now I'll just hand over quickly to my colleagues, Ruth and Julie, who will run through a very quick participatory poll just to see out of the current 50 participants we have where people are situated today and what their interests are. Over to you, Ruth and Julie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So we are going to run a short poll just to get a feel of the audience. So I hope you can all see it on your screen. I've launched the first one. The first question is, where are you joining us from today? So please go ahead and answer that. We have 73% have voted, 80%. We have an 89% voting. Okay, we can see our largest turnout seems to be from East Africa. We have about 12 from Europe. We have one person from Asia, one person from the Americas. So I guess we seem to have a great reach, generally speaking. I'll end the first question and go to the second one. So the second question, in which Eastern Africa country do your activities predominantly take place in? So I think you can go ahead and answer the same. So we seem to have a good mix. Majority seem to be from Kenya. We have a few from Uganda. Okay, that's 41 of you have voted, 41 out of 53. Okay, and my colleague Ruth will take you through the last question of the poll.
Hi everyone, thank you for your participation. I will now we are on the last question. So our last question will be, what kind of organization do you work for? The first one is government, NGO, the last one is private sector, development partner, financial institution, and others. S 36 have voted, and we have 15 participants from private sector, 6 from development partners, and yeah, and the majority are from private sector with 17 participants, 9 from NGO, 6 from development partner, 5 from other institutions, and 3 from government, and 42 participants voted for this one. Thank you everyone for your active participation. By this, I will end the polling question.
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, Julie. So I think that gives us hopefully that gives the other participants an idea of who else they're sharing the room with today. So now I think, Bianca, we can move on to the agenda for today in a bit more detail. I can go through the slide. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So again, just quickly running through this, we're programmed to take a couple of hours of and we've completed the introduction, so we'll move straight into the first session after the intro, being just a step back or a look towards what's happening at the higher level. Much of what we're talking about obviously is governed by what happens at the negotiations under the UNFCCC, and we're fortunate to hear from UNFCCC themselves and the UK government, of course, as we build towards the slightly delayed COP. Then we'll take a little bit of a negotiations side and then move deeper into potentially what is a bit more relevant and of interest to the private sector players who've joined us this afternoon. And we're going to walk through, as Bianca presented, kind of 3 core topics across the week. And the first one is the CDM transition. So I'll just give a very short presentation at the beginning of that session to just present some figures around the CDM profile and the voluntary carbon market profile from across Eastern Africa and the 7 countries that make up the alliance. And then we'll hear from the UNFCCC again, and then from Stefan Hock from Perspectives with regards to what is at stake in terms of the CDM transition. And then Gloria, our colleague from GIZ, will then run what will hopefully be a decent amount of time for a question and answer session. So you're again encouraged any time to type in your questions via the chat, and there is likely going to be an opportunity as we open up for the Q&A for 2 or 3 questions to also come to the floor and do a traditional kind of handing over the mic at that stage. But Bianca, I think that gives everyone a decent idea of who's here today and what we're going to go through over the next 1 hour and 40 minutes. So I'll hand back to you for the first panel.
Thank you, Tim. Sorry, I'll just stop sharing my screen for a minute because we have with us 2 speakers today who are really knowledgeable in the matters of negotiations, and we're really lucky to have them expound on their views on what's going on in Article 6. And to start us off will be Mr. Perumal Arumugam from the UNFCCC, who's the lead support for Article 6 and Kyoto Protocol mechanisms in the negotiations. I'll put up his presentation, just give me 1 second. I can share the screen. He'll be joining us via phone. So, and Perumal, you have the floor. It's just a reminder that for speakers, it's 10 minutes for this session. You may go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Bianca. First of all, thank you for inviting us to present where we are with respect to negotiations. And it's always like a bit boring for private sector to hear where we are with negotiations, because we more think of on the ground things and how it would impact on the ground when we do actual real mitigation activity. But with the Paris Agreement framework, we have to have much more cooperation between public and private in order for us to move forward in achieving the goals. So the second slide, it's just the purpose of this presentation. Bianca, if you could move to the next slide. Yeah, thanks. So this is just to give some reflections on the outcomes from the Madrid and also on the current ongoing discussions in the Article 6. This is a general caveat that we normally provide is to have this Chatham House rules, because the organization that we come from, we try to present where we are with respect to the process without remaining neutral and impartial. So anything that we say cannot be associated with as personal views. The presentation basically focused on one particular text, which is the latest text, which is the version 3 from the Madrid COP, and that we are using as a focus for this discussion today. So here, as Bianca has put forward, like Article 6 is a composite of 3 different elements. It's the one is the cooperative approaches. It's called as the Article 6.2, 6.3 in the negotiation rooms. It's about the bilateral, more the activities that you can imagine are the bilateral and the multilateral cooperation between interested countries involving the transfer of mitigation outcomes. The second one, as Bianca was earlier mentioning about the voluntary markets and the clean development mechanism, a kind of synonymous to that. That's one part of the Article 6, which is the Article 6.4. This is to be operated centrally by UNFCCC, crediting emission reductions by public and private sector. And this is an area where you have a direct interaction with the private sector, similar to the CDM, which then allows for international transfer of those credits for the use of NDC or for beyond. The third component, as you see that in an UNFCCC context, you always come for political compromise. So within the cooperation, when you have 2 elements covering markets, there was also another element which is non-markets, and which basically facilitates the climate action through international cooperation focused on sustainable development and poverty eradication. Like you can imagine as an example of certain results-based financing tools and mechanisms where the credits are not traded. I think one of the things that's rootly fundamental and where there is a clear consensus is that Article 6.8 do not create a tradable commodity. So that's the difference between the earlier 2 and Article 6.8. Thanks, Bianca. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you may have known that since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there was a timeline set that the outcomes of all the Paris Agreement work program has to be adopted in Katowice. And one of the things that could not be achieved in Katowice was the Article 6. So then it had a greater focus since this is one of the Paris Agreement work programs that could not be able to be completed in Katowice. This was considered in Madrid, and it has got a lot of limelight as one of the key potential negotiating thing that needs to be concluded. So in Madrid session, the objective was to adopt 3 decisions, like as you have seen from the earlier slide, one for each instrument, 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8, with the detailed rules for Article 6 implementation, including robust accounting and avoidance of double counting of emission reductions. Unfortunately, the objective was not achieved, similar to the CMA. One in Katowice, outcome on Article 6 was procedural, as agreement could not be achieved on some of the key major issues. The decision came from Madrid was to basically say that to continue the consideration of Article 6 on the basis of the 3 draft decision texts, with a view of recommending a draft decision for consideration and adoption by CMA 3 in Glasgow, now in 2021. The next slide, please. Yeah, one of the scopes of this presentation is to highlight to you that the key major outstanding issues from Madrid with respect to Article 6 negotiations. I think in the introduction, again, Bianca has given kind of a overarching contextualization to Article 6, saying that it is different when you have NDCs are there and when it has to work hand in hand. The first issue that you see here, the avoiding double use of units from Article 6.4 mechanism. This is one area which is completely different to what we have been experienced within the CDM framework, where you know that as the countries that do develop these mitigation activities as developing countries did not had any obligation to account those in the country's emission totals, whereas in the Paris Agreement, with everyone has an NDC and everybody has some kind of a contribution towards the Paris Agreement goals. This is no longer the same situation. So the biggest issue here was there were two altering views. One view is that any Article 6.4 mechanism, like assume for a simpler example that if you are involving in market-based mechanism activity similar to CDM, for example, if the CDM transfers X amount of credits to be used elsewhere, the originating country has to add those transferred emission reductions as a part of the national emissions, which means that creating an environmental debt within the national jurisdiction or within the national emissions, which was not the case in the KP. So the key fundamental sticking point is that the many countries do not yet have an economy-wide target, meaning that the whole sectors are not part of their NDC. Certain sectors, certain gases, certain policies are only part of the NDC of those countries. So really how to differentiate and whether or not it should be differentiated, whether if an emission reduction is achieved from a sector that is not part of the NDC or within part of the NDC, how do you differentiate them with respect to accounting? Since the second topic that I have put on CDM transition is going to be covered later, I would take a couple of more minutes to explain that the difficulty in having an outcome in Article 6 with respect to avoidance of double use. Primarily, like you can imagine a situation that you are in a country and the country has energy sector in its NDC. And if you undertake a nitrous oxide reduction activity in agricultural sector, whether the emission reductions that are transferred from the agricultural sector has to be added by the country where the mitigation activity happened, where its NDC is only energy sector. So that was the critical issue, and it has a larger economic consequence for the country that is undertaking such kind of mechanism. So it's beyond just an emission transfer or an emission unit, emission credits transfer. It has larger economic consequence because the country is taking that debt as a part of its emissions. The second part was baseline and additionality. You would know very much about how it was followed until now in the CDM, where you have three approaches, like you use the historical emissions, you look at the economic attractive course of action, and also you look at benchmarking. But whereas many parties wanted, considering that one of the major principles of Article 6 is about looking at racketing or ratcheting up your ambition level, you need to have a specific type of baseline approach, which is the using best available technology as your baseline technology. So there a lot of conversation is going on whether or not that this would cover every single type of activity. Like again, in market, we know we might have dealt with greenfield activities, brownfield activities, retrofitting, refurbishment. Can for everything, can the best available technology can be the baseline, or you need to have other approaches? So that's a bit more technical, but it also has a larger consequence of the amount of emission reduction can be achieved because the baseline determines what is your eligible amount to credit. The fourth point is one of the area that we are talking about where we are coming, the most participants today. Like I learned from the poll that we have about 70% from the African region. This is one of the very strong points from the African region, that where in many African countries that adaptation is a core element than mitigation. So how does these market mechanism assist in those countries in providing sufficient finance for their adaptation action? So we again, experience from the CDM, we know very clearly we pay 2% as an adaptation levy when you have a CDM registered activity, when you transfer or when you provide the modalities of communication to transfer the units, we pay 2% as an adaptation levy, which is replicated in Article 6.4. But many know that the volume of transactions are going to be very high in Article 6.2 in comparison to Article 6.4. So how does those such transactions in Article 6.2, where you have a bilateral cooperation amongst countries, can assist adaptation action? So thanks, Bianca. I'll try to complete in 3 minutes. So the whole issue is that for some, since it was not being explicitly mentioned in the Article 6 outcomes from Paris, this is going against the principles of the Paris Agreement. For many other countries, that there was an experience in Doha where when the second commitment period was discussed, there was an there was a principle or a precedence whereby these kind of Article 6.2 kind of activities like the JI mechanisms, etc., there was a decision to look at whether or not how the share of proceeds or the contribution to adaptation financing can come from such kind of cooperation. The last element was the overall mitigation in global emissions, which is like you provide a certain amount of emission reductions, kind of a environmental tax, where the benefits are neither used by the originator nor by the user. So meaning like if you have produced 100 tons of CO2, a certain portion goes for the benefit of the environment, 2% or whatever percent, and the buyer country will only use 98, or when the seller country can only sell 98 and the 2 has to be kept in a certain account, 2 or 4 or 5%, that's still being negotiated, so that neither the originator nor the user can use it, but it is for the benefit of the environment. So this is again enshrined clearly in Article 6.4, where it says that the mechanism aims to achieve. So some people interpret aims to achieve can also be done with measures other than discounting, like meaning reduction of 2% or 4% or 6%, but to have a very stringent baseline. On a technical means also you can achieve, that's one view. The other view is that no, you need to have an absolute discounting. This is within 6.4, but in the bilateral cooperation also, again, it's a very strong point from the African region that you need to have a level playing field between Article 6.2 and 6.4. You cannot benefit one mechanism over the other within the same UNFCCC framework. So therefore, what you apply for 6.4 should also be applied for 6.2. So that's where the confusion, or that's where the big contradiction lies within the negotiation table. Next slide, please. Bianca, if you could move. Yeah, thanks. So just, I would not go through this detail because of the time limitation. You will have the slides to see. But just to say that the Article 6, when it comes to COP26, it works like 4 sides of a square. So the issues related to adaptation finance, pre-2020 ambition, the long-term climate finance, and Article 6 with transparency together forms, there will be a lot of push and pull around these items. So the political compromise would be found as a package with all the other major issues, not just as Article 6 as we have seen in Madrid. And then there are also many other outside developments happening, like the new demand centers like ICAO, etc. Those needs monitoring, and the outcomes from those would also influence the negotiations within Article 6 when we go to Glasgow. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in Madrid, like it was very close for an achievement. The best that we could achieve, like to private sector community, we know that we need to have an outcome. So to reach that outcome, the best possible thing that could happen is that the parties would minimize the rollback. As you have seen that, like I said, that there are key outstanding issues. You have seen 4 issues other than the CDM transition. And in many other cases from Katowice, like the list was around 11 or 12 key issues. And people were able to reach to some kind of a common ground in Madrid on all those issues. So if there is a minimized rollback from where already the compromises have been achieved, it is still hopeful that we would have an outcome on Article 6 in Glasgow. And Article 6 is real, like there's a strong real world potential for cooperative action. And this is one of the need for countries, for many countries, that to increase their ambition levels in the NDC. So we strongly believe that it has to be a consensus story where like all countries, all interests, and inclusivity like the Paris Agreement needs to be derived with all the 4 other items. The last slide is just to say why Article 6 is important. And I think I don't need to beat around the bush for private sector, why Article 6 is important. So this was like, sorry, I was running because it's just 10 minutes to say what has been negotiated for such a long time for the last 4.5 years. I hope now you get the gamut of the issues that why people are grappling with not getting an outcome in Madrid. You might, as a private sector, you would appreciate that these are not small issues which have larger economic consequences for the country. Thanks, back to you, Bianca, and would happy to hear from my colleague from UK telling us as our presidency what we will be doing for the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Parimal. I'll just share my screen one last time. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Mr. Hugh Salway. He's the Senior Advisor for Article 6 and Response Measures for the incoming presidency at COP26. And I believe basically Parimal has given us a basis of where we are right now, but I'll ask Hugh to take us on what the road to COP26 entails and the strong engagement from the incoming presidency. You have the floor.
Hi everyone, thank you very much, Bianca, for that introduction, and thanks to Parimal for giving a really good overview just before on Article 6. So, hello, my name is Hugh Salway. As Bianca said, I work in the UK's COP26 presidency team, where I lead on Article 6 negotiations. I've been following the negotiations for the past few years, so have seen all of the effort and pain from Katowice and Madrid firsthand, and have also been involved in some of our piloting work from the UK as well. So the UK has a number of programs which use our climate finance to pilot carbon market activity. So Parimal's given a really good overview of Article 6, the main issues, what happened in Madrid, and some of the things that we need to consider as we move forward towards COP26. So what I plan to do is to spend a bit more time talking about the wider context of COP26, before then giving a few more specific reflections on Article 6 to build on what Parimal has said. So when we look ahead to COP26, the first thing that we have to confront is the postponement. So in an alternative world, we would right now be just a few weeks away from COP26 and hopefully a few weeks away from a successful outcome on Article 6. The situation we find ourselves in is obviously different to that. And for obvious reasons, that's very unfortunate. I think we all wanted to have an Article 6 outcome at the past two COPs, and certainly this year, but we find ourselves in a different situation. So I just wanted to say a few things though about the postponement. So the first thing is that a lot of consultation is ongoing with all parties, and I know with many other stakeholders as well, on the plan for the way forward. So what the negotiations look like next year to get us to COP, how we do that in a way which makes sure that we can make the progress that we need to make on Article 6, but also on other issues as well. But how we do that in a way that is safe, firstly, and reflects the situation on COVID, but also a way that's inclusive, because we know that different countries will be experiencing COVID at different rates, and you need to make sure that we're moving ahead towards COP26 next year in a way that involves all parties in the discussion. So those consultations are ongoing now, obviously in quite a difficult, wider context. The second thing on postponement is that the postponement of COP doesn't mean that action itself has been postponed. So we are still seeing countries coming forward with updated NDCs ahead of COP next year. So I know that Rwanda, for instance, is one of those which has come forward with its updated NDC already this year. And from the UK, we are planning to do so as well in advance of COP next year. We're also seeing companies coming forward with corporate climate contributions and commitments, and for many of them, the voluntary market will be an important part of that. So there are some interesting discussions going on now on how the voluntary market will evolve in the context of Article 6, but also in the context of greater demand. And then finally, just linking back to the negotiations, we may not be able to meet in person, but there is a lot of informal dialogue which is happening between different negotiators, between ministers at the expert level, at the senior negotiator level. And it may not always be as visible as the standard intersessionals, but engagement is happening. And we in the UK team are continuing to speak to as many stakeholders as we can, but also to all of the parties on Article 6 and all of the different issues that we will have to deliver on when we come to COP26 next year. And so just very briefly, before I turn to Article 6, I just wanted to put it in context when we come to COP26 next year. when we get there, there's going to be sort of three broad things which I think we will see in the run-up to COP26, and that's the summit itself. Firstly, in the run-up, we are hoping that countries come forward across the globe with more ambitious NDCs, some of which we're seeing already, but we need to see more on that as well over the next year and a half. And we are looking quite closely at how Article 6 is reflected in these updated NDCs, whether there's a progression in plans to use markets from when countries came forward with their intended NDCs back in 2014 and 2015. So I think that's something definitely to note over the next year and a half. So secondly, on top of NDCs, there's a few areas where we are working with many partners to drive further action across the real economy. So we're looking to drive that action to support stronger efforts on adaptation and building climate resilience, to work with the transition to clean electricity, to support a greater uptake of clean transport, enhance the use of nature-based solutions, and then finally to mobilize all of the finance which is needed to make the transition across all of those different areas. And then the third and final thing which we are working on as we move towards COP26 is, of course, getting the comprehensive negotiated outcome which we all need from COP26 in the negotiations themselves. And in that, it's very important for us, as I know it is for all parties, that we see a balance in the negotiated outcome across adaptation, mitigation, and finance, and that all three are reflected and move forward together. And a big part of that negotiated outcome is finalizing the remaining elements of the Paris rulebook. So the parts that weren't agreed in Katowice a couple of years ago, as Perimal mentioned. And the main one of these is Article 6. So I'll come to that now. So I won't cover the issues themselves, as Perimal's done that, nor what happened in Madrid. But I just want to stress four kind of main points from my side when I'm looking at where we are and where we need to get to. The first thing to stress is that the extra time that we now have with the postponement of COP is certainly being used. The negotiators continue to speak regularly in informal meetings, and in those they're looking at some of the issues, some of the subjects that we need to move forward if we are going to have operational markets, but maybe we haven't had that time in the past. So there's more of a focus now on the transition to the 6.4 mechanism. So the elements of the CDM which can be sort of moved into the new mechanism and how that happens. And there's more of a technical discussion happening there, which I think is very valuable and in any case would have needed to happen in this time. The second point is that we are certainly not starting from scratch as we move towards Glasgow next year. As Perimal said, lots and lots of progress was made in the run-up to Madrid, in Madrid itself. And while parties may want to look again at some of the things we made progress on, I think hopefully a lot of that progress can be retained. And just to reflect that, I think when we went into Madrid, the text which parties were faced with had about 600 brackets in it, which sort of represents disagreement between different parties, between different countries. So we went in with 600, and by the time we reached the final few days, we were down to just a handful of issues that weren't resolved yet. So I think that shows firstly that progress has been made, but secondly that there is a willingness to find constructive solutions, and I think that willingness continues and sort of is carried on. And that takes me to the third thing, which is just that willingness. So we've spoken in the UK team to all different negotiating groups. We've had several really good discussions with members of the African group who speak in the negotiations. And from everyone, we've heard a clear commitment to getting Article 6 over the line, to finding a solution to the last 40 issues, which we've not been able to have a solution to in the past. And so I think it's really positive that we see that commitment now, and we hope that that continues and is reflected in how parties engage as we move towards COP next year. And then that's the final point, which I just want to mention, is that commitment to getting Article 6 over the line is one that we in the UK team hold very strongly ourselves as well. As it happens, the incoming COP president designate, Alok Sharma, who will be presiding over the COP negotiations next year, appeared in front of the UK's Parliament earlier this morning and answered questions on COP26 and on Article 6 as part of that. And the thing he stressed when it came to Article 6 was that, firstly, we're committed to working towards an outcome. And secondly, he emphasised the fact, as Parimal said, that this needs to be consensus-based and we need to have an inclusive outcome and one that reflects the text of Article 6 itself, which calls for an outcome which offers higher ambition in adaptation and mitigation. So that's what we in the UK are committed to working with parties to achieve. We've been speaking a lot to people already. That will continue. We want to speak to all parties and also to all different stakeholders. And so that's why I'm really grateful that Bianca's invited me to join this. And I'm hoping, if I'm allowed, to join as much of the sessions over the next few days, because I think there's some really important issues which are being looked at in those days on the CDM transition, piloting of Article 6, but also on NDCs and how Article 6 fits into them. And these are all of the issues that we as a whole need to deal with and we need to understand. So I think it's going to be a really good few days, and thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I think between yourself and Parimal, there's a lot to be taken in, but it's really good to see that a lot of consultation has been going on, and definitely we're hoping that a lot of the private sector input is coming across. We are running a bit slightly behind on time, but if anyone has any questions, kindly put them in the chat. If not, I'll just summarize quite quickly and then we'll move on to the next session. But I had a very brief question I wanted to ask Parimal. I don't know if Parimal's still online. Yes, just one each question, very brief. Hello, Parimal, is Parimal still on? I don't know. Oh, okay. Well, I'll ask you my question then. So with these consultations that have been going on, has the private sector actually managed to get its voice across? And what is your hope for the consultations with Eastern Africa for next year as we move on to COP26?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I will learn from Parimal's technique to hide off the meeting when it comes to questions. But no, we've certainly been speaking to representatives of the private sector, so to some individual companies, to trade associations which represent project developers, but also kind of the wider business. And so we've been hearing from the private sector. I know that others have as well. But I mean, I sort of come back to the point I made earlier about kind of having an inclusive approach. And I think that not all voices are always heard equally, I'm sure. And so that's why I do really value this approach, this meeting here, and I value this opportunity to speak to those who are on this call. And on engagement with East Africa, I mean, we're always happy to speak about Article 6. My colleagues working on other issues are always happy to speak as well to kind of any representatives who want to speak. And as I said, we've had good conversations so far with negotiators who speak on behalf of the African group, and we'll continue to speak a lot to them as we move up to COP26 next year on Article 6, but also across all of the different issues.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Thank you for those words. We'll move on to the next session because I've seen a question coming in that is actually quite related to that session. And this will be on CDM transition, something we've been hearing quite a bit of. And I'll just share my screen. Apologies, just give me one moment to share my screen. As I introduce the next speakers. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Tim Carman. He's the director of Carbon Africa and also representing the Climate Finance Innovators. And what he'll do is take us through the regional carbon market profile, because as I mentioned earlier, Eastern Africa has been participating in carbon market activities through the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, but also through the voluntary carbon markets. Tim, you have the floor.
Thanks, Bianca.
I'll You have a presentation, right?
Yes.
Yes. A lot of figures. So it's good to see the activity going on in the region. Yeah.
Okay, I see. You can now see my presentation. Yes. Okay. So yeah, it's my job just very quickly to maybe take the negotiations down to the level of the projects being developed in the region. So as Bianca said, there's quite a strong history across Eastern Africa. It's all about the 7 countries of the alliance that we're focused on in terms of CDM project development, but also on the voluntary market side as well. So I'm just going to give some statistics or figures to give people a flavor for what we're talking about here in terms of scale and the types of activities that have been developed and are likely to be developed in the future. So I think the first context, we know now that we're living in Paris Agreement context, so the NDCs continue to be the principal vehicle or policy document that all countries are working with. So all countries in the region issued their INDCs originally between 2015 and 2018. And as Hugh mentioned, Rwanda also has submitted their updated NDC already during the course of this year. Overall, I mean, this is yes, it just gives you a flavor. Clearly, the countries are individually committed.
Sorry,
to,
Tim.
yes?
Tim, sorry. Is it possible to enlarge the screen so
Sorry,
that
yes, I thought I'd done that. Yeah, apologies. Yes.
Thank you.
So yeah, clearly all countries are individually responsible for their commitments under the NDCs, but we've just given a flavor. There's kind of a 32% commitment across the region by 2030 within the NDCs as an average figure. But that is clearly subject to some of those key points that have been raised in both Bromel and Hugh's presentations around the need for support in terms of finance, investment, and other areas as well. Those initial estimates we've added up across the NDCs of around 270, there's over 265 billion USD for both mitigation and adaptation, so significant investment required. And clearly these figures will be further enhanced and updated as the updated NDCs are submitted by all countries across the region. And yeah, referencing the use of international market mechanisms, there was 4 out of the 7 countries that explicitly mentioned this in their original submission. And yeah, who knows, maybe that number will go up as we move towards the COP26 and the updated NDCs. So that's the broader context now. And I'll just now dive a little bit deeper into the CDM portfolio. So on an African level, the region represents, so 54% of all CDM activities that have issued, this at the activity level, not at the credit level, are actually housed in Eastern Africa. So a very good contributor within the context of Africa. We're talking about over 450, 460 CDM activities have either been registered or included. So over 50 project activities and over 400 CPAs. So that's the components inside programmatic CDM activities. And there's quite a distinction. I mean, this is a lot to do with the CDM itself and how it's structured, but there was a lot of emphasis, first of all, obviously on project activities, and quite a large percentage of those projects were related to renewable energy. So a lot of grid connected IPPs, independent power producers, from wind, from solar, from hydro, etc. And then we saw a shift as programmatic program of activities, the POAs came in. There was a large uptake across Eastern Africa. Most of those, because of the policy reasons, were registered post 2012, but there was a real shift in the kind of nature of those activities, the underlying activities. And we can see that 59% of those POAs are related to cook stoves. So we're talking about distributed energy access, which is clearly an important issue for Africa and for development in Africa. In terms of issuances, we're approaching 10 million credits that have issued across the region under the CDM alone. That's 34% of activities in the region that have issued, and a large percentage of that actually can be attributed to the Bujagali hydroelectric power plant in Uganda, but also a strong participation from cook stoves, water purification, and geothermal as well from the likes of KenGen in Kenya. Next, if we move on quickly to the voluntary carbon market, which I think has played as important, if not more important, role within the region in relation to also CDM. So again, there's 234 activities. There's a little bit of a crossover with the CDM, as you'll be aware, but there's 234 activities included or registered under the voluntary standards. And the standards we looked at here are the gold standard, the VCS, and Plan Vivo as well. And we'll be hearing from gold standard and VCS later in the week. But then there's on the gold standard alone, we're talking about 15 million emission reduction certificates as well. And the vast majority of those are in addition to the CDM credits. So that's around 10 million CERs under the CDM, and then 97% of the 15 million credits issued under the gold standard alone are VRs, so they're indeed different from those CRs. So that's approaching kind of 25 million credits, both under the voluntary market and the CDM under the UN scheme as well. And again, a lot of those under the voluntary market, certainly under the gold standard, are related to cook stoves, which so I didn't explain earlier, is around energy efficient cook stoves, either switching fuels away from charcoal or using more efficient stoves and using less charcoal for cooking practices. The next one is on, so yeah, in terms of, those are strong numbers from my perspective. So a long, strong history with both the CDM and the voluntary markets across all of the countries in the region. All of the countries have some degree of experience with both of those mechanisms for generating emission reductions. However, there's still a lot of potential in the pipeline. So we're talking about 10 million CRs issued, but there's potential, or there was potential, if we look at all of the potential CERs or credits that could have been issued up until the end of this year, it would have been 95 million if all of those credits had been issued. And if we look at 2030, we know that the transition is on the table, there's kind of over 320 million. So just to give you a flavor of what's in the pipeline in East Africa. And the tale I told earlier of the project activities being registered pre-2012, clearly a lot of those projects are starting to come to their end. As you'll be aware, the crediting period cycles are either 7 or 10 years. So we're looking at kind of pre-2012. Some of those projects are looking to renew their crediting periods, but yes, some have already expired. And 64% of those project activities will actually expire by 2022. So some degree of a positive market signal and ability to transition is likely needed for those assets to be transferred under the new provisions of Article 6. And then just digging a little bit deeper in terms of those issuance rates. So under the project activities, that's a 19% issuance rate up until 2020. But if we remove Bujagali, which is one of the largest, by far the largest credit generator in the region, that drops to kind of 6.4% and under 5% for program of activities. So good successes, but there's a lot of capacity and potential for emission reductions locked into that pipeline that the region is really looking to take across into Article 6. I'm sure that's why quite a few people are listening in today. More positively, some very interesting recent developments in the pipeline, I would say. So the World Bank has had a strong history across the region through commitments from other countries funding their climate finance funds. But through the Carbon Initiative for Development, CDEV, there has been activity recently on registering programme activities and including those component activities, with a lot of focus around off-grid energy access, be it through biogas or mini-grids, etc. And interestingly, over 170 component activities, which from our interpretation have some links to the Korean emissions trading scheme. So it's a different market demand source moving forwards for Eastern Africa. And then quickly, the last 2 points from my side. The region is also, in terms of piloting Article 6 and looking at utilization of the new mechanisms, 4 things here that are of interest. So the joint crediting mechanism is bilateral agreements between Japan and other countries. And in Africa, there's 2, Kenya and Ethiopia, that have had long-standing engagements with the JCM since around 2013. The World Bank, again, has been piloting the standardized crediting framework, at least in Rwanda, but also looking to do the same in another couple of countries. The adaptations benefit mechanism of AFDB, we're also aware is looking at piloting within the Eastern African countries, and the CLIC Foundation from the Swiss government as well is also receiving letters of interest or letters of intent from countries. So public statements around Eastern Africa is open for business with regards to Article 6. And then my last point on Corsia is just that, there's 2 airlines already engaged in the region with offsetting in a voluntary basis, and that's Kenya Airways and Ethiopian Airlines. And I'm sure they'll be looking to continue that kind of post-COVID context. And I think that's it from my side, Bianca. So I'll hand back to you. Quite a few stats there, but hopefully gives people a flavour for what we're talking about in the region.
Yes, it definitely, I think it definitely does. Gives them an idea also of, the sectors that really flourished under the CDM, like energy and cook stoves, but there's also a lot to think about, like you were saying, with nature-based solutions as well. So there really is a lot to think about. And I mean, 54% of African issuance is not a little. So we shouldn't overlook that at all. And we should hope for an even higher number now that we're moving with the Paris Agreement. But yes, definitely, I think the statistics are really good to have, to know where we are and where we're going. So our next presenter is Perimal. I think he's back. So I'll just share his presentation one more time. Perimal, are you on? Can you see?
Yeah, I'm on. And sorry if I missed any questions to take last time. I lost the connection in between.
Yeah, we'll answer them in the Q&A session, so it's all right. Yeah. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Bianca. So as I indicated last time in the earlier presentation, that one of the key topics of where there's a lot of convergence and also a lot of divergence is the transition of the CDM. So I would briefly touch base upon that. Like I thought, rather than speaking, it might be better to put one slide and run you through. So if you go to the next slide, now you might have been more familiar with this slide, which I have shown earlier. Yeah. So this is, I'll jump into the 2 things, like it is in terms of, if you could go back, Bianca. Yeah. So this again, like as I said earlier, as I said, like in terms of the transition, both the Chatham House rules as well as that it's all based on the latest version of the text in Madrid. So I would basically divide the whole transition conversation into 3 different buckets. So the first bucket was in relation to the transition of infrastructure. Like when we say infrastructure, the issues related to the DOEs, the accreditation standard, the methodological standards, registry as an infrastructure, etc. And the second bucket is about the activities, like the CDM registered activities, the physical asserts as such. And the third bucket, I would say, in terms of the transition conversation, is the accumulated or the potentially to be accumulated units that are generated from these assets as a tradable litigation outcomes. So when you take in terms of the infrastructure, there's a larger consensus within the room. Like if you remember in the last session when I said that the most critical thing that for us to have an outcome in Glasgow is that parties stick to where they have progressed and not to roll back of where they have moved. So what I'm saying is that with an understanding of what is there in the text currently, the infrastructure transition was not deeply contested, and there's a general acceptance or a degree of comfortness in transitioning them, and it is for the new supervisory body similar to the CDM executive board and the CDM. In accordance to the Paris Agreement Article 6.4, there would be a supervisory body that would be established, and that supervisory body can see for the fit for purpose for these infrastructure and how they could be accommodated, how they can be directly used, what modifications are needed to make them fit for the purpose of Article 6. It's up to the supervisory body to decide, but there was no kind of an abstraction by saying that this infrastructure cannot be used. It all says that it can be used provided it can be made fit for what the new rules are saying. Then the second level of buckets, as I said, was with respect to the activities. So for that, like if you see the latest text in the slide, the first bullet point is the transition of activities allowed following an eligibility check. And the eligibility check could be different things, like because negotiations doesn't go into that kind of a technical detail. From this, you can interpret that there is an in-principle agreement within the parties that you can transition the CDM activities irrespective of when they have been registered without any vintage dates. It could be as early as there in the CDM, when the CDM became existent, starting from the first registration date of 18th November 2004, or it could be anything, as long as that they fit into the eligibility check that will be designed by party. That is like very clear, is that like there's an unequivocal support that the before in KP, it is going to be a much more greater relationship that has to exist. So the countries has to be aware of what they are agreeing to, because it may happen that in Article 6.2, they might be agreeing themselves to do corresponding adjustments, meaning that they would adjust their national totals or emissions as against the emission reductions that you as a private entity transfer to another private entity in another country. Not necessarily this has to be an Annex 1 country or something in the KP, it could be any country. So one thing that where there's a strong thing is there, like one of the steps of transition is that to have a communication with the host party. Then there was a timeline that was set in the draft decision text as 2023. This is with an assumption of a minimum of 3 years from the time that you have an adoption of the decision in Madrid. The PPs would have 3 years to transition their things into the future based on, you might have seen that the interim step of developing any other eligibility check, etc., but there is a 3-year frame of time. Now, since in Madrid, we did not have an outcome, and now COP is being delayed by 1 year, these timelines can be, you can see 2023 in brackets. So some countries wanted this to be 2025, so that we need to see. The other thing that is there was the transition activity may continue to apply the CDM methodology until the earlier of the end of its current crediting period or 31st December 2023. This also relates to the earlier time. So even if the parties agree that you can transition, but if you don't have a methodology to calculate those emission reductions on what are the eligible emission units between 2021 to 2023, the transitional arrangement that is in the current text is to say that you can use the CDM methodology until the time when the transition needs to be completed, or if your activities current crediting period is ending, like meaning the second crediting period of the 3-year crediting period, 3-term crediting period is ending in 2023, whichever comes earlier, until then you can use the CDM methodology. That is in the third iteration of, or the third draft decision of the Madrid text. The last one was in terms of corresponding adjustments, like how do you adjust for the transferred emissions? It sets up the general principle by saying that every emission reduction unit needs to be correspondingly adjusted. But then it also says that there should be an opt-out period during which a host party first transfer the Article 6.4 units from sectors and gases. So meaning that the two dates that are being discussed are like 2020 immediate, 2025 or 2030. Those are the three dates that were on the table, but in the final text it says that the parties would consider further in the CMA. But you agree that everything needs to be adjusted, but there should be a flexibility for a certain period of time. It could be time-based element, or it could be other criteria that need to be defined. And in terms of the CERs, like just one thing, like as I said, the third biggest area of the larger disagreements is with respect to the transition of units, CERs. So you need to keep that in mind. Many times people just gets confused between activities and units. When it comes to activities, the current stand of the parties, as on Madrid, it's a pinch of salt, because anything can be, like the famous language in negotiations is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But if you go by what there is in Madrid, the transition of activities can be of any vintage. For use of the credits that are generated before 2020, the two time periods that are being negotiated, which came closer to the end of Madrid, was 2013 and 2016 as a vintage period, meaning that like emission reductions generated after 2013 and emission reductions generated after 2016. And in Tim's slide, you have seen the last slide on the CORSIA. So if you see the CORSIA decision also, it is somewhere around one of these days. So that's where in my earlier conversation, I said it is also very important for Article 6 room to follow what is happening outside of the UNFCCC negotiations. That will have an impact within that room. Can you quickly go to the next slide? I will take less than half a minute. So one of the other things that they asked me to cover was about where we are with respect to CDM at this point in time, and I would be running back again. I would take the questions and probably I will respond. The board meeting has begun 15 minutes ago. So the meeting is considering a information note prepared by the Secretariat on the implications on the postponement of CMP 16 on CDM operations, on what to do for activities from 1st January 2021. But again, there is some confusion, like that you can submit a request for issuance, or you can request for issuance even in 2022. That's not an issue, as long as that the emission reductions are from a period before 31st December 2020. So sometimes people again get confused here that nothing can happen after 1st January. It is about the new emission reductions, or the emission reductions for time period, the monitoring periods, if they starts from 1st January 2021. So this is being currently discussed, because this is also one of the things they asked me to cover. And I don't have any direct answer. So once the board convenes, you would have a better idea. Thanks, Bianca.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Parimal. I hope that has given a really good insight. There was a question on the dates. So Parimal has said that the text definitely has different vintage years that's being suggested for units between 2016 or earlier. Some of it is aligned to CORSIA, so it's still in discussions, but definitely the text can give some guidance in that case. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Stefan Hock, who's the Managing Director for Perspectives, who will give us his presentation on the same issue as a technical expert. Stefan, one second, let's stop. And again, thank you to Parimal, who has to go to the EB board right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Parimal. Thank you, Bianca. Can you see my screen just to confirm before I get started? Excellent. Yes. So I'll also switch to presentation mode, and then hopefully we can get started. Good. Yeah, so I also now will speak about CDM transition, and I'll apologize in advance in case there's a bit of overlap between what is in my slides and what Parimal just talked about. That is partly because, as you just heard, he now needs to go to support the EB, and I kind of prepared myself in case he wouldn't have been available at short notice. But what I generally want to do in my presentation now is to look at things a little bit more from a slightly more practical point of view, with now an independent expert perspectives. So I'm the director of Perspectives German office in Freiburg. I'm also leading the Climate Finance Innovators project, which is also supported by the German Environment Ministry's International Climate Initiative. We work quite a lot on carbon markets and climate finance across the African region, and also support the African group in Article 6 negotiations. I'm explaining that partly because I want to make it clear that what I will provide is a bit of an independent expert view on where we stand right now. And I hope that can maybe, point out some of the crunch issues that we are facing urgently now, increasingly urgently, a bit more clearer, given, the understandable, more neutral presentation that the Secretariat, of course, naturally provides. So I'll just very quickly reflect on where we stand now with this transition process. We'll quickly talk about some of the key issues which are structured very similarly than like Peruma, although we focus on the methodologies a bit more than on the general broader infrastructure, given that this determines scope and credit issuance a bit more directly. And then I'll also talk about practical implementation of these things, practical implications of these things, sorry. Good, so where do we stand? I think one thing that I'll now emphasize a bit more, that Tim has of course already provided a good foundation for as well, is that a lot of the CDM reforms that we appreciate today that took place over quite a long time really was pushed for by African countries and benefited African countries quite a bit, as you saw in the overview of the East African portfolio. But a lot of that came really quite late, after the carbon market had already crashed, after CR prices became rather unattractive. And I think what we need to understand is that quite a comprehensive and solid foundation has now been built. And the question of CDM transition is not just about negotiating rules, it's also about what happens with what we've built so far, and how can we secure a future for that is organized in a smooth way. So we've already talked about that what the negotiations have produced, where we stand and so on, what the objective is for COP26. But what I do want to highlight, the last part on this slide, a bit more clearly, is that the deferral of all of these different negotiation tracks that relate to CDM transition, they really mean that we will not find an agreed solution within the second commitment period to the Kyoto Protocol, which ends in just a few months at the end of 2020. And as we will hear more...
Sorry, Stefan, is it possible to full screen? We can't see the full screen of the presentation.
On full screen? I put it on full screen, sorry. What is this now?
Oh, it looks like it has notes. Okay, that's it, okay.
Can you see the full screen, Bianca?
Yeah, I don't know why I'm not seeing it as a full screen, but that's okay. That's all right. That's right. I think it's my screen that looks weird. Please go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, to me it looks like full screen. If anyone has advice, please let me know. If you can see all the content, I would say let's proceed. And okay, good. So I'll as I said, the framing here with regard to how Perumal presented is slightly different, given that we don't talk about the other infrastructure, but just on the methodologies, because that influences the specific generation of credits and activities more directly. And I'll talk more about activities in units, because I think that's more urgent, but still this issue of methodology transition is also quite important, because that relates really how we will interpret these principles of baselines and additionality, etc. In the future after 2020. And what I do particularly want to highlight is the timeline that we are now looking for. As Perumal mentioned, 23 is in the text, which is of course the end of the truer period of the Kyoto Protocol, and therefore also the CDM. But if you have ever developed a new methodology or done a methodology revision, you know that this is quite a process that requires to undergo certain steps of the CDM activity cycle as well, comparable to the CDM activity cycle. So we visualized that here just in order to highlight that really a number of steps by different actors are necessary, and we do think the timeline is really very, very tight, even though we don't have anything on rules and criteria yet. And I'm showing this in particular because the same actually will apply to activity transition, where we have all these different, checks and balances and regulatory steps. And we really think this timeline is extremely tight. And we all may recall, this process ahead of 2012, when there was really a rush into the CDM pipeline in order to meet deadlines like this, and it really clogged up the system and didn't always lead only to good process. So we think it's extremely important to be very keenly aware of the tightness of the timeline. Pay attention to that. Last point on methodologies is that now you see here a chart of the CDM methodologies used in Africa in projects and POAs, or rather CPAs here in orange. And you can see that the vast majority is really concentrated on just a handful of these methodologies. So you can see for yourself whether your project may use one of those, but the main message is, if you really focus on the most relevant methodologies, fast track them and really invest a bit of effort in that, that will go a long way in order to make sure we have the methodological toolkit ready to move from CDM to Article 6. Good. I'll skip that slide. Now I'm moving to the section on activities. And this slide basically gives you an overview of what the presidency text says. This is now more or less the same what Pierre has said, so I'll skip that as well. And I want to add on, what does this mean for the African CDM portfolio? You see the spike in activity generated by the EU deadline in 2012, and that it really, it continued afterwards, but it really slowed down quite a bit. This is what I meant earlier with potential rushes into the pipeline ahead of deadlines. And the one last thing I want to point out here is that we see the POAs here in green. They continued to be registered, but at really very significantly smaller numbers. But what's quite interesting now in the next slide, here on this one, you see that even though few new POAs came into the pipeline, you see on the table on the right that these existing POAs really start to, let's say, fill up with component project activities, with CPAs. So I don't have time now to explain the concepts here, but I think you are mostly familiar with what a POA and a CPA is. So I leave it there, and I will also say that I'm showing a number of graphs that I don't have full time now to explain properly, but I still thought if anyone wants to go back to the slides, so they're quite useful to take a second look and understand the issue a bit more deeply. The slides and the graphs are taken from a presentation that I will also show in one of the last slides, so that you know where it comes from and can take another look at that. But what it means is that even now, the POAs and projects didn't register so many more after these different time periods, which, by the way, we designed according to those potential cutoff dates that are in the COP presidency negotiation text, so prior to 2015 and afterwards, etc. We really see that more activity is taking place than one could understand at first glance. And this slide shows you a bit more in detail on who does what. What needs to be done by the different negotiation tracks, the substem, what needs to be done by the supervisory body once it is in place, and what needs to be done by the host country. So it shows that a lot of different things are to be defined sometimes by bodies that we don't even have in place yet. And that is just underlining this point about urgency of the issues. So what that boils down to, what you see here in red, is that it's impossible, basically, to agree on all of those criteria and rules prior to the end of 2020, as I already said. And I do think many of you are most likely in positions that feel very uneasy about that because you don't know whether your emission reductions from active and approved crediting periods will materialize after next year. And I think this is really, now the conundrum that we are in, that we don't have negotiations that can make decisions prior to late in 2021. And at the same time, we are in this situation where we need solutions for those practical questions. I'll explain a little bit more about why that is such an issue in the next slides. So you see quickly again on this table a bit of a distinction on which body is taking which decision, but I don't think we need to go into the detail yet, but just again as a resource for a better understanding of what the issues actually are about. So last point, content-wise, on CI transition. Again, Perumal has explained this rather well. The main 2 points that I want to quickly reiterate to really make it clear is that we're not talking about any volume of CERs that is to be transitioned or specific vintages of individual credits, but we're really talking about cutoff dates as per the activity. And even that is not as clear as it sounds, as we'll see on the next slide. And the second thing is, until when can we use these credits? These are all things that we haven't figured out yet properly, but that are becoming now increasingly urgent as well. So here is, again, the overview of the text proposal. I think this is also sufficiently presented already by Perumal. So what I want to show you here, again, bringing it more closely to the African context, is the implications of the registration cutoff dates. We did an analysis of what does that mean for the African portfolio in relation to the global portfolio. And what you can actually see, what's really quite interesting here on the right-hand side of the slide, is that the share of African CERs really increased quite dramatically in the last time period since we had the Paris Agreement agreed. And of course, that is partly because the issuance went down globally. This is the percentage value. But it still speaks to that we have a relatively recent African CDM portfolio that is now implementing the reforms that we have achieved and that is now at stake. Good, this gives a bit more detail on this. Again, yeah, a little bit more detail, but I think this one is crucial. What the presidency text does not talk about, but again, what's crucial for project developers, I believe, is whether these cutoff dates on the activity level, do they refer to the CPA level or the POA level? We don't know all of that yet. And I think, in my view, personally, it's a clear example of, where negotiators may not have the same immersion into these practical issues and may just not pay the right attention to that. So it's really important for the private sector and the project developers to make their voice heard, to point to these issues that need to be clearly regulated in order to avoid uncertainty. So this is absolutely crucial. We don't know whether these dates refer to CPA inclusions or to POA registration dates.
Hi,
Good.
Stefan.
Yeah.
Can you take 2 more minutes? Oh.
Yeah, I'm planning with that and I'll manage. Thank you. Good. So coming to an end on CI transition, there is a lack of analysis and shared understanding of what is actually now, the overall volume of pre-2020 CR potential. I think this is a bit of the backdrop for some of the controversies because there's very different views about which volumes we're talking about. So there's more analysis needed here, and I think we'll hear more such studies in the next months coming out. There is, a broader discussion on what these presidency texts will mean, and there is also alternative CR uses. But this is all a little bit more focused on negotiations. I want to use my last slide, my last content slide. What is the implication of the lack of transition rules as we end the second commitment period to the Kyoto Protocol? What's really clear is that in the absence of negotiations, the CDM Executive Board plays actually a crucial role through, let's say, activity level and regulatory decisions that will most likely establish precedents for CDM transition or, set a certain path in lieu of the ability to negotiate on the multilateral level. And specifically, that refers to new activity registrations, to the renewal of crediting periods, CPA inclusions, and CER issues. This is really controversial, and what they are talking about now is, right now at the EB meeting, is really important. There have been a lot of discussions, sometimes a bit more in the background, sometimes a bit more overtly. But if you look at the annotated agenda now to the currently ongoing EB meeting, you see that all of these issues on the table. There's different opinions between the Secretariat's view, the registration and issuing team's view that supports the EB. And all of these things will be really, really crucial for the short-term practical CDM transition, because the calendar doesn't stop even if negotiations stop. And we do have really a lot of these things now becoming increasingly urgent because we couldn't find the agreement on the level ahead of time. And I think what's really important here now also to understand is what is the mandate and the authority of the CMP versus the EB. The CMP being the negotiations track that is discussing issues related to the Kyoto Protocol, of course. And the EB is operating under that authority. And I think what we really need to pay attention to as somebody who has a stake in projects is whether the EB operates within its mandate or whether some issues actually require a political agreement that we currently don't have. And last point that I think underlines a bit why we need to have a good solution here is, personally now on an observational level, we hear of first project developers that shift to voluntary standards because of frustration with uncertainty in the CDM. So I think we all want to avoid that, because the multilateral system really has a lot of value for governance, inclusiveness, and representation. Very important, especially for developing countries. And I'll end on that just with a final note, quick plug to a more comprehensive study on this issue that you find on the Climate Finance Innovators website. I've showed the cover page here and the link is in the slide. With that, I'll thank you also in the name of my co-authors of this paper who helped me prepare some of this input, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan. We'll be sharing the presentation so that everyone can have a chance to look at the figures presented in more depth and go through it again. I would like to invite now some project developers from the region who can share some very short reflections based on their activities. We've already received some questions that we'll do a Q&A after for Stefan and Permal. But if we could please have Kenjan to say a few words, James Meto from Kenjan, 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes most, and another practitioner will follow, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So James Meto, if you're from Kenjan, he'll be representing Kenjan today. Is he available? James or Stanley?
Hi, Bianca.
James,
you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Is it possible to put on your video?
Yes,
2-3 minute reflection based on your experiences as a practitioner in the region. Yeah.
Yes, Bianca. So just to share a few highlights on the experiences of Kenjan. One, like the presenters have said, the CDM process was a bit slow in Africa. And for us, we were lucky to have worked with the World Bank in implementing some of our projects. Kenjan has a portfolio of 6 projects comprising of hydro,